college admissions interviews are a waste of time and resources. And most universities seem to agree. Among all of the silly and absurd aspects of applying to college, interviews are the most bullshit. Of the 16 admissions factors on the most recent NACAC survey, interviews rank 4th to the bottom in importance. They rank below AP or IB scores, extracurriculars, recommendation letters, and they only rank above work experience, state graduation exam scores, and even SAT subject tests before those are discontinued. Half of responding universities say they're not important, and another quarter report that interviews are of little significance. The emphasis on interviews in the holistic review admissions process seems to be declining over the past decade, yet more programs than ever require them. In fact, no other criterion has witnessed such a steep decline in importance. Many institutions openly concede that interviews are rarely the decisive factor for a candidate. Usually they couch it in the language of, don't worry so much about it. But unsurprisingly, if you Google college interview, you're offered nothing but guides and tips. Yet no popular blogs seem to question whether they should exist at all. And I claim in this video that they shouldn't. So if interviews are not especially important and are rarely a deciding admissions factor, then why in the hell do many students sometimes interview a half dozen times or more each year? The answer, of course, is college admissions is madness. Determining how many universities recommend or require interviews is a challenge because, unsurprisingly, there isn't a comprehensive database of interview requirements. They also change from year to year. At least 70 universities offer the option, which isn't including honors programs or scholarships that often require an interview component. Some universities and programs allow students to upload a short video of themselves as if they're auditioning for a reality television show. Most Ivy League universities and US News Top 50 private universities allow for interviews. Adding confusion to exactly how they factor into admissions are whether they're optional, recommended, strongly recommended, or required. In most applicants' minds, the nuances between the first three not optional options are perceived as equivalent to being required by applicants who are seeking to gain an edge in any way possible. NACAC's website features a guide titled "The Truth About Interviews," which leads with an opening sentence. The truth is, most college interviews are relaxed, informative, and even fun. But the truth about interviews is that they're utter bullshit. Visit Reddit's Applying to College community anytime between November and January, and you can see the stark disconnect between how universities perceive the importance of interviews and how the subjects that they're interviewing perceive them. Because for most students, it's neither relaxed, informative, nor fun. Reassuring students that if they're unable to interview and that it in no way harms their admissions chances seems suspicious to me. Students may not be penalized, flagged, or assigned negative points for opting out of an interview. However, the claim that interviews don't disadvantage applicants is suspect. Suppose some students are helping their candidacy by interviewing, and if spaces at universities are a zero-sum game, then doesn't it follow that students who opt out or who are unable to interview incur a subtle penalty? For example, at MIT, only 1% of students who opted out of interviews eventually gained admission, compared with 10 times the number who gained admission through interview. If NACAC was being honest rather than serving as a shield for universities' interests, they would correct the record. Everything universities communicate about interviews is misleading and arbitrary, and students honestly are correct to feel doubt. Every university that conducts interviews weighs them differently, which further complicates an already foggy holistic review system that I've belabored the point in previous videos. Students and families scour the internet to find what interviews really mean at whichever university they're applying. Alumni volunteers or admissions representatives usually conduct them. Your interviewer may or may not be the first one to read your admissions file or serve as the counselor assigned to your high school's recruitment territory. They might make written notes or assign you scores based on varied criteria such as curiosity, ambition, fit for major, and so on. And universities might request an interview of you, but for others, you're expected to reach out. Not every student who gets interviewed gains admission, and not all admitted students pursue an interview. Some universities use interviews for evaluating your candidacy, and for others, it's merely for informational purposes. For example, it's naive that Cornell communicates their interviews are for informational purposes only, while expecting a prospective applicant to act any less neurotic. Students even often attempt to set up interviews for universities that don't provide them, such as the University of Texas at Austin or the University of California System Schools. For each highly selective university, the interview apparatus requires thousands of contact hours and tens of thousands of emails to coordinate and carry out. Applicants collectively conduct hundreds of thousands of interviews each year. It might be the single most time-intensive and wasteful aspect of the collective college admissions system, even though universities themselves admit that it rarely makes a difference. It's especially silly to conduct interviews during a pandemic when everyone is already overburdened and stressed. The college interview started around a century ago, first, unsurprisingly, at Harvard University. Other Ivy League schools followed, but the interview functioned less to determine one's academic qualifications or their fit, and it was more to ensure that they came from the right background. Adoption of interviews spread to other universities with the rise of modern holistic review in the second half of the 20th century. Programs that conduct interviews claims that it allows them to get to know the whole student better, presuming incorrectly that a half-hour interview can adequately assess a candidate's interest and character. College interviewers occupy a position of power over the interviewee, whether they're conscious of it or not. To an admissions reviewer, you're just another application, and the same analogy applies that you're just another interviewee among many. Whatever an interviewer's real or perceived capacity to influence a decision, applicants feel pressure to make their best first impressions because their lifetime goals are either hinged upon it or perceived to be hinged upon the importance of these interviews. Every implicit bias and systemic cognitive error relevant for admissions reviewers also applies to interviewers. Errors in reasoning are amplified by the power imbalances between interviewer and interviewee, insider and outsider, older and younger, and gatekeeper and supplicant. One error, called the fundamental attribution error, mistakes someone's personality or behavior as fixed, rather than subject to changes in environment or context. For example, a highly talented programmer who writes beautiful code might be less able or willing to verbalize their talents. Gifted poets might write eloquently, yet are terrified by an open mic night at their local coffee shop. Each student may be talkative, humorous, and playful with their siblings or best friends, and yet silent with teachers and adults. Interviews naturally privilege extroverts and conversationalists, providing ripe territory for applicants to bullshit. America's obsession with leadership adds a further disadvantage to introverts, who may be substantially more talented than their first impression indicates. Interviews are supposed to offer opportunities for students to sort of get off of their resume and discuss their interests and hobbies. However, students are coached so thoroughly to identify themselves through their accomplishments that even if they did have non-curricular interests outside of their resume, they're often less likely inclined to share about them. Before COVID, many interviews were limited to metropolitan areas, disadvantaging students living far from cities. It should be evident by now that students living in poverty or in non-college going communities are less equipped to navigate the etiquette of nominally meritocratic interviews, nor do they have the resources to hire consultants to prepare them. The Atlantic journalist Haley Glatter interviews MIT admissions dean Stu Schmill in her article, The Futility of College Interviews. Dean Schmill makes the predictable argument that interviews supposedly level the playing field. He says, quote, "These interviews can be particularly important and helpful for students who come from under-resourced backgrounds. And MIT is one of the most and more forward-thinking and transparent admissions offices, yet they succumb to the illusion that interviews help select talent and increase access for marginalized populations. But first-generation students who might benefit the most from interviews are the least likely to access them or even know that they exist. The ubiquity of college interviews further calls into question the sincerity of elite universities' commitment to diversity. Malcolm Gladwell, covering the corporate interview process in a 2000 New Yorker article, The New Boy Network, concludes that conversations are less useful and potentially more misleading than intuition suggests. He preempts his recent book, Talking with Strangers, that he published in 2019, where he there writes, "The most basic of human rituals, the conversation with a stranger, turns out to be a minefield." The best minds and most powerful computers at Google, McKinsey, and Goldman Sachs still haven't figured out how to reliably select for and to sort their applicants. Yale School of Management professor Jason Dana makes the same point 17 years later after Gladwell's article. Dana argues that free-form, unstructured interviews offer the pretense of getting to know an applicant. But the problem, he says, is that interviewers typically form strong but unwarranted impressions about interviewees, often revealing more about themselves than the candidates. His research suggests that interviews don't reliably provide information relevant to evaluating a candidate. They may be even more harmful, calling into question universities' absolute insistence that interviews can only help and never hurt applicants. Trained interviewers and admissions counselors feel that they're better than average than the typical person, and they also demonstrate a tendency towards illusory superiority in their ability to assess talent. I assume interviewers from the corporate world or who assess talent for their occupation overrate their abilities more relative to alumni interviews who work in unrelated fields. Said another way, honestly, undergraduate students themselves may be just as good at selecting future college students as career admissions professionals. Dana concludes in his 2013 study that interviewers probably overvalue unstructured interviews. Our simple recommendation for those who make screening decisions is not to use them. He advises that people who interview or occupy talent selection roles recognize the limitations of their judgment and not overweight their conclusions. College interviews are not an important part of the admissions process, yet they persist. They consume a considerable amount of institutional resources, time for the interviewers and their subjects, and are also ripe for bias and error. Among essays, standardized exams, recommendation letters, and other application materials, interviews seem to have the highest costs, yielding the least benefits. I argue that universities who conduct interviews do not have your best interests in mind. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. You can find my email in the information section of this video, so feel free to reach out if you're interested in working together.